Wei, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to this conversation.
Great stuff. Well, Wei, for people who don't know who you are, could you give us a bit of an introduction, please?
For sure. So I am a co-founder and CEO of a company called ArenaX Labs. People may know us from the game AI Arena, which is a AI-powered fighting game. Kind of harkens back to things like Super Smash Bros. And Brawlhalla. But the twist that we have in that game is people actually train AI models to learn how to fight like they do. And then once these AIs are trained, you can submit them to kind of compete autonomously on your behalf because they're effectively a reflection of your skills crystallized in this artificial intelligence model. So we've been building that game for the last 3 years. Currently, that game is live on mainnet, and people are able to try it out if they wanted to kind of get into learning about the gameplay. But in addition to that, we've also started to grow a gaming infrastructure business called Arc. And Arc is largely the crystallization of a lot of the technology that we built that went into AI Arena. Now that we are now distributing to third-party studios and helping them create some really cool and interesting AI-based game experiences, but then also helping them to solve some pain points in their kind of growth lifecycle and development lifecycle as well. So yeah, currently those are kind of the two main focal points with Arc being kind of our primary platform that we're starting to grow and really helping the broader gaming ecosystem level up in terms of using AI in empowering and improving their experiences.
Sounds really cool. Well, we'll go into that in just a second. Now, I've got a few questions around the projects, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Before we go into that, I'd love to understand a little bit more about your career journey so far. Could you talk us through what's kind of led you to this point?
For sure. So I'm older than I look, probably. So I've been in professional services for, I guess it's been 15, 16 years now. I started my career in traditional finance. Had done a bit of everything in finance. I started on more on the advisory side, doing mergers and acquisitions advisory, and then I moved over to more of the buy side, and spent a career within a Canadian investment fund, uh, covering all different types of investment strategies and asset classes, from private markets to public markets. And then towards the end of my tenure in TradFi, I was leading a large liquid strategies portfolio, so more public markets facing. We were kind of running our own money inside the fund, but also we were able to kind of invest through third party managers as well. And it was a very kind of interesting and expansive mandate. And while there, I also spearheaded the initiative to start a crypto investment mandate for that fund as well, culminating in a couple of investments prior to me leaving. And then we also started kind of incubating a machine learning based algorithmic trading strategies kind of program. And ultimately was able to scale that to about $750 million. So that was like the starting point of my career was largely TradFi. That's when I started discovering crypto, falling down the rabbit hole, and then it was during the last bull market in 2021 that one of my co-founders and I, Brandon, we were colleagues at this firm. We started to dig into NFTs, and we were starting to think about how we can use NFTs as a kind of a primitive to really uh, empower a new wave of like IP effectively. Because from our perspective, NFTs were just kind of these general purpose containers and you can drop almost any type of content type into it. Brandon's thought immediately went into AI models and how that could be basically a IP content type. And we started ideating on how do we commercialize like tokenized AI. So that's where kind of the gaming piece came into it. We felt, okay, gaming is this like portal to the consumer market, and if we can kind of abstract away some of the complexities of what AI is under the covers and deliver it as like an engaging experience for players, this might be the avenue for us to really introduce something that's really cool to the market and kind of get AI and that type of intellectual property to be more widely owned, and also allow it to be um, more readily allow the value discovery of these types of IPs to be more kind of market driven, and give people who are creators of this IP an avenue to directly monetize for themselves. So that was like the initial thesis. And yeah, in 2021 we raised a seed round, and then we've been at it for 3+ years now, building this kind of platform to where it is today.
Sounds cool. And to go from TradFi into Web3 gaming probably isn't the traditional route that most people end up in gaming, right? Like,
No.
did you always have a love for gaming? Did you spot that that was an area of the market that you could make a big impact, for example? Or was it out of pure, I just love gaming, so I want to come and do that first, or look at that as an area first?
Yeah. No, I think all of this happened rather what's the right word, like serendipitously, in the sense that it was I think the thought came to us in terms of, how do we commercialize something that's a bit more kind of complex and abstract in AI? And this was prior to like LLMs and generative models really becoming part of the public consciousness. Um, so so yeah, I think it was more of like the situation, the opportunity that we saw at the table, and the fact that Brandon, as an amazing engineer, is able to kind of translate conceptual ideas into actual working products. And that's really kind of how we got started down this path. I never in my life ever thought that I would be in the gaming business. So it was not by grand design. Having said that, I think branching from TradFi into gaming, although it's not something that we're kind of, we don't have a track record in this space, it wasn't necessarily something that we felt was a like going to hamper our ability to succeed. I think my prior experience in TradFi was also very kind of exploratory, experimental. Always had this streak of trying to connect the dots and make things work. And even if it's new, I had a lot of confidence in myself to be going into those situations and find a way to learn about how it works and try to use kind of first principles thinking and reasoning to try to make things better. So I think from that perspective, irrespective of whether it's gaming or any other industry, didn't really kind of compromise, our confidence in terms of where we can take this. I think really is at the end of the day is like hard work, um, persistence, consistency, but then also going into anything new without preconceived notions, and really try to decompose that value chain on a first principles basis, understand it, and then the rest of it is just like hustle, just like constantly trying to iterate, trying to figure it out. So I think yeah, despite the fact that there wasn't a plan behind it, I think we're grateful for the opportunity that we're in right now, and being where we are today. Hasn't been easy, but it's been very rewarding.
No, that's cool. Do you have any advice? Like, say if someone is in TradFi at the moment, TradFi specifically, and they're looking to come across into the industry, there must have been some challenges
Yeah,
at the start, or maybe some key learns that kind of stand out for you. If someone's looking to make that jump, have you got any top tips you could share with us?
for sure. I think first off, probably speaking to the psychological aspect of it, one of the challenges with TradFi and transitioning from TradFi to something else is that there's always going to be this perceived high opportunity cost, and that almost always, not always, but very commonly would deter people from taking the plunge, right? Because especially as you rise up the ranks in TradFi, you're in a pretty good situation, all told, right? Financially. So it's that switching cost is quite high. So I think for people that are thinking about making a transition, um, the finance aspect of it does factor into your decision making, but ultimately you have to kind of really think through whether or not this is the right decision for where you are in your career, the context that's surrounding you in your personal life, because it is a dramatically different sphere that you're entering into. Especially if you're coming from a larger organization, you probably have a more well-defined role. Um, and especially if you're running money or running an investment strategy, it is a very specific type of discipline. Once you get into building, it's very it's a lot greater breadth and perhaps a bit less like shallower in terms of like what you're managing on each disparate vertical that now matters. But your day to day is certainly not kind of like honing and take one particular discipline. You have to be kind of everywhere at all times. Now this is if you're kind of branching off and becoming like a founder or co-founder level person, because obviously as you build an organization, there's specialization, etc. But I think people need to understand the nature of what you do very much changes. And, you got to be honest with yourself. Like, are you someone that really enjoys a very repeatable, reliable process that you have honed and crafted over time and just basically exploiting that and maximizing your ability to kind of derive edge in that space? Or is it you're yearning for something else where it's like complex, dynamic, shifts really quickly, and your energy is allocated in many different directions at the same time, and all of those things have to ultimately come together for it to work. um, yeah, it's not a simple transition. I think one mental model to use is probably there's like a similar arc when you progress through a larger organization where when you're at a lower level, you're usually more specialized, and then when you get up to the ranks of management, it becomes a lot broader, and it's a breadth of skills that you now have to cultivate. That's why a lot of times, like really good employees don't necessarily make great managers, is because it's just a radically different skill set. It's like that, but 10x or 100x. It's like now you're outside of the realm of a established institution, and there's so many more variables that are happening at an extremely rapid pace. Um, and that kind of pacing is also a very different thing to try to manage on a day to day basis as well. So, not sure if that's like advice, but it's just like a recognition of like this is what you're getting yourself into, and you have to be very aware of it because like some people do prefer predictability, and I'm good at something and I just want to keep doing that. There's no shame in that. That's very that's very that's great. That's great for certain people. You have to want the other things that come with like entrepreneurship, building, growing, especially in a extremely dynamic industry that is Web3.
That's brilliant. Really good insight. I think that's really important for people to understand the mindset shift
Yeah.
of doing that. Because I think from the outside looking in, the industry has this. I guess people have a view of the industry of it being this really cool, cutting edge sort of place. And everyone thinks I'd love to get involved in that, but actually, probably doesn't suit everyone. There are roles for everyone in the industry. Like you need people across finance, operations, HR, marketing, engineering, products. Like you need all of these people, but
Yeah.
maybe not everyone has the right sort of mindset to go into it. And I guess if you go into it with the wrong mindset, that's when your expectations are maybe a little bit differently, and then maybe it's not what you thought it was going to be. But that's really useful for people to understand. Um,
Yeah.
did you always know that you wanted to be an entrepreneur eventually? Was that the plan?
No. No.
No?
No.
Okay.
I think honestly, when I was younger, I think my default view of my professional career was, I'm going to do something that's like, just like perfecting a craft and just like rise through the ranks. Kind of like the default template that you would expect in like a career arc.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know what it was like. Maybe I would say I was in my like mid late 20s when kind of a switch went off, and maybe it has something to do with I started to like grow into myself a little bit and starting to understand what like really drove me. And I can start seeing examples of areas where I really excelled. And I felt like you have those moments of like the effort and kind of the creativity you brought into something create an outsized impact on the result. And you're like, whoa, this is different than just doing your job. You know what I mean? So I think that was like starting to accumulate those experiences in your career. You're like, oh, okay, like if I applied myself in this way, this is where I have outsized impact on an organization that I'm in, the group that I'm in, you know. So I started using that as a way to kind of guide my decisions in my career. So I started to seek out more and more like things that were off the beaten path, and I didn't shy away from any of that. So, and I think my circumstances rewarded me as well. I had really good kind of mentors and people that like believed in me and kind of gave me a lot of latitude to express my curiosity, explorations, and kind of like creativity to build something new, despite the fact that it was still within an established, organization. So I think that, yeah, ultimately gave me the confidence to like step out and start, building something, you know, completely in the wild, so to speak. And it's so like even like the concept of our company is so esoteric as it is, right? Like it doesn't fit into a nicely packaged box. Yes, it's gaming. There's an AI aspect of it. What we were doing in AI, no one really understood. Like even with this AI explosion, people still don't really understand because they all just like think LLMs and generative models, and that's not what we do.
Mm.
So there's always been this, we're for better for worse, very independent and very convicted in what it is that we want to achieve and what we want to build. But that comes with its own challenges. You have to, fight for your space in this grand ether of everything that's happening, right? So, but yeah, I think it started from having those initial experiences that builds like confidence, and then you can take that learning and take that progression and level up to the next thing that you want to do, and it just kind of scales from there.
Nice. So you got way more satisfaction out of looking across the broader things than you did focusing on a very specific role.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I think so. I think at the core, it's like I think what makes me really tick is trying to connect the dots on different things that maybe don't have any relationship on first pass, but it's like, oh, okay, these things are connected. And initially, it was just like trying to figure it out like a puzzle, and now it's more like you take that skill set, you start figuring things out, and you're like, okay, now what do I do to create impact? Now that I know this, and then so like building is another dimension on that, because now you're an active participant in this phenomenon that you're observing, and you can actually interact with the system to either mold it, change it, take advantage of it, right? But you can very quickly kind of experiment your thoughts and thesis and hypothesis in this environment, and that's a lot of fun. It's very stressful, but because you're like it's high stakes.
Yeah.
But it is also like when things work, it's an unbelievable level of like satisfaction. So yeah.
Well, I've got some questions on that in just a sec, if that's all right. But before I go
Absolutely.
into that, I think a lot of people would look at your current, if we just go off job titles, right? Your current title as a co-founder of a project and chief operating officer. A lot of people would look at that and think, that's my career aspiration. So I want to achieve those levels. This might be quite a hard question to answer because I guess it varies, but
Yeah.
could you talk us through a day in the life of? What do you do as a COO? What
Yeah.
do you do as a co-founder? And what do you do molding the two? Like, can you give us a bit of an idea of that?
Yeah. Okay, so maybe let's just start from the definition of what the role is supposed to be, right? Like COO, you're in charge of the business operations of a company or a project or an entity. And so in our context, business operations is everything outside of engineering and creative. So those are other departments, but literally like finance, operations, legal, marketing, you know, all of the rest of that stuff sits under my purview. So there's a lot of disparate things happening throughout the day, right? And I have to understand where our finances are. Sometimes on the accounting and the bookkeeping side, I need to understand where, how the money is flowing, etc. What is our burn? What is our run? So that's an illustration of some like the operating pieces that are like recurring throughout a day. I'll have to kind of dedicate some amount of my time to that on a recurring basis. There's the personnel side, the HR side, right? The team grows at certain points. Sometimes you have to make the key decisions or tough decisions on retrenching and or making personnel changes. That factors into it. Legal and regulatory, massive area that you have to spend a lot of time thinking through for this space in particular because it's very gray, a lot of uncertainty. So, working with external counsel, working with our internal counsel, and analyzing business decisions that we're making, how much risk are we taking on? Is that a deliberate risk that we want to take on? That factors into a lot of my day to day. And then there's in Web3, it's like a lot of it is also marketing, PR, getting out there, telling the story of the brand, building that trust with the community, and frankly, like rising above the noise threshold, which is actually really difficult to do in Web3.
Yeah.
It's one of the one of the noisiest spaces, right? Um, so that takes an incredible amount of time. And when you're a small company, more and more of that rises to the level of like a co-founder. You kind of have to do all of those pieces. You don't have the luxury of like, I can delegate everything to other people. Not that you don't trust them, it's just that you don't have enough bandwidth to be able to operate in that way as a starting point. And then the other part of it is like Web3 does have this tendency to want to see more visible leaders. Because the other side of it is there's a lot of unsavory characters in Web3, and there's a lot of things that aren't good. And as an ecosystem, I think we are still wrestling as an industry of how do we actually engender trust with the community, with our customers, with our clients, because for every example of good actors, there's 10 examples of bad actors, right?
Yeah.
So you're almost like always fighting that uphill battle. So I think that's where you start to stack in like the nuances of like what a day to day feels like. And then the other thing is like your role ebbs and flows over time. So at a particular moment in time, let's say you're going through a very heavy promotional period where you're launching a product. Maybe 70% of your day is dedicated to things that are more PR and marketing driven, because that's what's required of you in that moment. And then there are more times where you go into a fundraising period and literally your entire day is just talking to all the investors, like meeting business development partnerships and all of that. Yeah, and then other things will come into the fold and require more of your time. So the it's people generally would say the days aren't really that structured, because at any moment I feel like there's probably like 25% reoccurring things where it's just like every week you have to kind of get through them, and then there is like another 30%, which is like what it is that is like the focal point of the business right now is where you're dedicating your time. Another like 20% is like you always have to have capacity for being a visible appearances, AMAs, like spaces, interviews like this, going to conferences, all that kind of stuff. And then another like 20-30% where it's just like contingency. Like you don't know what tomorrow holds. Like sometimes something just blows up and you're like, oh, I'll have to deal with that today. And you had no idea. And you'll know that my math doesn't add up to 100% because it's not 100%. It's probably like 200% that it adds up to, because you're like, this is not a 9 to 5, right? Like it's just around the clock 24/7. So you constantly feel like you should feel like you're operating at like always almost like at your limit. And sometimes you discover that, oh, that wasn't my limit. This is actually the limit. There's more that I can kind of like extract. But yeah, that hopefully that gives you kind of a lens into like a day in the life. Yeah, I mean, on paper, I think everything looks, it's like, wow, yeah, co-founder, building something really cool, exciting industry. But I don't think like, personally for me, I don't take that for, like, I don't think about that too much. This certainly doesn't really like feel like it. Like, it's not like you're a big corporate executive sitting in your like 50th floor corner office in a tower in downtown metropolitan area. That's not it,
Yeah.
right? Like you're in the weeds and just like in the, as they call it, in the lab, right? just grinding it out on all dimensions. But like, I think from the perspective, like, I've experienced what it's like to being like corporate to this. I think there are aspects that you appreciate on both sides, and I think ultimately, again, it comes down to what is that thing that makes you tick, right? What is that thing that's going to get you going every morning, where you like, yeah, okay, let's get after it. It doesn't matter how hard it is. Like, this part of it is like what I want, and then the rest of it that comes with it is what comes with it.
Cool. That's a lot of context switching
Yeah,
by the sound of it.
yeah,
Where this might be quite a hard question to answer, but where do you think you learned how to do that from? Is it just trial and error, get stuck into anything, problem solve, and work it out, or do you think was there certain points in your career that helped you when you were maybe learning how to do some of these things? What do you think?
yeah. I think I think contact. Yeah, certainly there was an aspect of like my prior career in TradFi. There was a couple of opportunities that I had where it really required me to develop the skill set of context switching, and it was very dynamic as well. It was dynamic in a different way. The volume was very intense, and there was a lot going on, so I had to manage breadth as well. So through that, I learned how to do it and still be effective. Because frankly, it is overwhelming sometimes, and if you're not able to, um, you know, be able to focus on certain things at a moment in time, and still compartmentalize other things that you have to do, and being able to like almost have this like complex like calendar type of puzzle in your mind of like, I need to do this now, this is the most critical in order to figure out all these like critical path items to get you through your week, your month, your next quarter. Like, it would be very difficult to kind of build a business in this dynamic, right? So I think yes, experience had something to do with it. I don't know if like from a personality standpoint or like innate kind of characteristics of who I am, maybe gives me a certain level of tolerance to be able to deal with that amount of stuff to coexist at the same time. So I think I'm able to tolerate uncertainty and stress to a great extent. I'm not saying that it's not stressful. It's extremely stressful. It's just you can tolerate it to a certain extent and not have it like basically devolve into chaos. So I think probably having those things do help, and I think part of it is also like, I think with maturity you start to learn that strategically or tactically at certain moments in time you can actually let certain things go. Whereas I feel like in my younger when I was younger, you operate in this environment where you would be like, everything has to be perfect, like everything has to be like buttoned up and fully tied up, and that's the only way. But you start to understand like that's not a way to build a business, right? Like, if you're scaling a business at any moment in time, there's probably one or two key decisions that drive all the impact, and everything else is just like, it is what it
Yeah,
is for that moment. And if you try to scale in a way where it's like everything is like scaling in lockstep with each other, no, I don't think that's a recipe for success. But it's actually quite difficult to flip that switch mentally for a lot of people, and this is where they do find challenge in terms of context switching, because it's almost like they can't. It's counterintuitive. It's not something that's like natural to make that trade off decisions along the way, because you're not trained to do that. You're not trying to do that in school. You're not trying to do that in your, early career. Like there's not very few situations where you're naturally like honing that skill set. It's just, I think over time you almost like you're forced into situations where you start to realize, okay, if I try to keep doing what I'm familiar with, like it won't work out. So I have to find another way.
Yeah, that's really good insight. I guess you have to have that North Star metric, right? Like you always aim for that or keep that metric in mind. Like you focus on that one thing and every decision you make points towards
Yeah,
that metric rather than trying to have 10 different things across all business areas that you're constantly trying to juggle that then you just miss things, right? And that's
yeah,
not a good place to be.
yeah,
I think that's really good insight for people to understand because Web3 is such a it's probably one of the most entrepreneurial industries that I've ever recruited into. You know, you chat to most people, and most people would love to, that I speak to anyway, would love to run their own project one day, or start something, or they might have side gigs going on, or whatever it might be. Um, could you maybe talk through some of the things that you think people need to be aware of? I know you've touched on a few things there, to be honest, but could you maybe talk through a few things that people need to be aware of before they launch projects of their own?
particularly in Web3, right?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and maybe I'll frame my answer just thinking a bit more about like what is unique about Web3 that they need to understand. I think, yeah, one dimension is just it's super dynamic. I think like everyone uses that word like Web3 is so dynamic, but it's like it really is. You don't understand until you're in it, and you're like, whoa, there's the sheer amount of things that you have to be aware of and factor into your decision making, how you manage everything is a lot. So I'll give you some examples. I already mentioned many times you're building in public. So even at the small, like you're a startup, you're like an infant company, but there's this aspect of stakeholder management where you operate like you're a public company. But the cadence is even faster than public. Like for a public company, you report to your board and stakeholders every quarter. In Web3, it's like, your stakeholders will literally DM you like every day.
Yeah.
And like that in and of itself gets to become a lot to manage. And if there is one thing to say, like, yes, you want to build that relationship with your community, etc. But you can also very easily allow that to consume your time and consume your entire life if you wanted to, because if they have a direct line of access to you, you're a customer service rep as much as you are a founder, right? And you're just dealing in the front lines with your stakeholders, who also, by the way, happen to be economically tied to the success of your. So they're kind of also like owners of your business. So that part of it is very difficult to manage. Um, Most young people who are very enterprising and entrepreneurial, they have never had to manage stakeholders.
Mm.
Point blank, they haven't, right? And this is, you see a lot of mistakes that people make in Web3 where one is they don't know where to draw the line, because it's not, I think there's this like false pretense like, oh, you have to be super radically transparent in Web3. You got to always listen to your community. It's like, no, no, you don't. There, you have to have a North Star. You have to know where to draw the line. You have to take feedback where it's constructive and useful. And there's a lot of things that's just noise. And you should not even entertain it, because that is counterproductive to what you're trying to achieve. So, how do you create a framework where you can still engage, but manage that energy and that kind of um, finding a way to balance that? It's very, very difficult. I think even for the most seasoned professionals that have had to manage stakeholders, if you put them into Web3, they will tell you, holy smokes, this is a whole different ball game in terms of how you communicate, manage, the emotions and the morale, the energy that kind of just like morphs over time within these communities. That's one area that you have to be very, very cognizant of. Another is just you have to understand the competitive equilibrium of this industry is extremely challenging. And it's because of a few things. Number one, Web3 technology is truly global. I know a lot of industries say that they are global. They're not, right? Like if you're a physical industry, you're physically divided by borders. You're physically divided by jurisdictions. There's very clear regulatory frameworks that govern how supply chains operate in different regions. There's protectionist policies that are, you operate by kind of like this physical world, right? And then you jump over to like the digital world. You look at social media, and you may think that things like social media platforms are global. And the truth is, they're not. Like, they're actually fragmented. There's dominant platforms in different parts of the region, right? There's these type of kind of consumer clusters, if you will. Web3 is different. Web3 is actually truly global, right? The ownership of something like Bitcoin, ETH is extremely distributed across the world. In fact, adoption is probably faster in emerging markets than it is in advanced economies, right? Now, that's a great thing in the grand scheme, but building a business is very challenging because this is first time a truly globally competitive business. Your competitors are not people in your backyard. They're not even in your continent. It's literally someone in like Southeast Asia or Africa or any of these other areas of the world. Those are your competitors. They can be also very dynamic, and they don't play by the same rules that you do, right? A lot of these other jurisdictions, very, very weak regulatory frameworks, right? And people can get away with a lot more than what we potentially can in North America or developed Europe, etc., where there's much more robust regulatory frameworks and enforcement agencies that can have the resources to act on certain things. Now, what I'm not suggesting is, people should be like breaking laws or anything. What I'm telling you is people play by different rules.
Yeah.
Business practices are different. You need to understand that. And if you're in that competitive context, decisions that you make, you may not know this because you're not accustomed to the business practices of people elsewhere. But if you don't have the awareness that this is what they're doing, you will lose on certain things, right? Because like what's kind of an assumed level playing field in your mind is not that in other people's minds, right? They will take advantage and exploit every possible kind of advantage that they can get. So I think that a lot of it is you have to start to understand what are quote unquote the rules of operation, especially in this vacuum of a lack of rules, right? And this is kind of is very frustrating in our space, right? Because we have leading institutions and governments and regulatory agencies that we're all trying to bring them into the fold and say, hey guys, what we actually need is more clear regulation. Like the fact that there isn't anything clear that's being written about how to operate is probably one of the worst things for this industry right now. And it enables a lot of the bad actors and the things that we see that make the headlines because they're sensational. And it's because there's not any clear rules. So then people decide to take advantage of the system where they think they can get away with it. And then that kind of moral compass or business ethics compass is very different depending on where you are in the world. But that becomes your competitor set. So I think especially if you kind of grew up and operated in a Western context, it's an eye opener for sure. And I think if you talk to a lot of founders in the West, even if you talk to VCs in the West versus the East, they have completely different vantage points of like what they think the levers are to pull for success. It's very, very different. So I think you have to have an awareness of that. Like, and you need to have the ability to embrace that as well. Because you can't just hide behind the fact that, oh no, that's not how we do things here. It's like no one cares. like yeah, okay, we can all talk about, theoretically this is what we should do, but in reality, this is what you're up against. So do you understand that? So that, I think that's another area that's very different about Web3. Um,
That's
and
really
then,
just if I can
yeah,
cut in there. That's a super interesting thing to understand. And how,
yeah.
as a founder, uh, how do you combat that? Like, do you just try and ignore the noise and just focus on building what you're building, ignore the competition, and do what you can do? Because I guess in those sort of situations, you can only control what you do, right? Like, you can't control the regulation in a completely different part of the world. I don't think. Maybe at some point in the future, there may be some guidelines that will be similar, but to get regulation the same in every single part of the world so that everyone's on this on the similar like level playing field is, I don't know if that will ever happen, right?
No,
Um, so
it,
as
it,
a
it-
founder,
yeah.
do you have to ignore the noise and just focus on, right, this is what we're building and just stick to the plan, or how do you combat that? Yeah, I know it's quite a vague question, but
I, I don't think you can ignore it. I actually don't think you can ignore it. But what I'm not suggesting is you kind of um, relent to a level where you compromise your business integrity and moral compass, right? Like you should never compromise that. So you you should know that at every stage, decisions that you make ultimately do come with like certain consequences. And in I think specifically on like the regulatory side, I don't think there needs to be like a common regulatory standard across the world. But I think leading geographies have to play a leadership role. And we know who that agency is. They just haven't done it. You know what I mean?
yeah,
And quite frankly, if they came to the table and became more transparent and actually put things on the table, a lot of other economies and geographies just follow suit because that's what happens in the traditional world anyway. So I think it does start with leadership, but I think as a founder, like I don't think you can ignore it because if you, it's one thing to say yes, you have to focus on your core competency and what it is that is going to create outsized impact in what you're creating. You should never lose that North Star. But you also need to understand the reason why you observe certain things about how this system operates is because other people are operating by different business assumptions. So what you observe in terms of the outcome, like the fallacy or the risk of not paying attention is you ascribe a an explanation for an observed phenomenon that wasn't the explanation to start with. And that will impact how you make decisions, and that is sometimes where you make fatal mistakes in miscalculation because you're like, oh, this is happening because of X, Y, Z. It's like, no, that's actually not the reason why. It's because people are doing this that's causing this. And if you have that mismatch, you may think that was the determinant of success. So you do the same thing that you thought was the determinant of success, and it's like, no, that wasn't the explanatory variable in all of that. So I think you do need to be aware, and you need like this is the awareness and the understanding of that information empowers you to now creatively problem solve so that you don't go head to head in how they compete. You find another angle to outcompete them in another way. But that is still, you know, in a way that's very thoughtful about regulation, constraints, and all of that kind of stuff. So, but if you didn't know that to start with, you can't devise a new strategy. And the worst part of it is just like you had no idea, and that ignorance actually led you to like a suboptimal decision because you thought the outcome was going to be something, but it's not.
mm, that's fair enough. I think in the industry as well, I guess another thing that you have to be super aware of when you're thinking of maybe a different solution to a different to a problem, or um, how you can make more of an impact in the area that you're building. Uh, there's so many people now, and I know we talk about Web3 being quite a small industry, but still I don't know if it is necessarily that small anymore. There's so many projects building so many things in all parts of the world and that kind of stuff. So difficult to have an eye on all of your competitors in every single region, right? Like even that gets quite tough to even keep an eye on what's even happening within your particular niche within the market. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I don't know if you have any tips for that on how to really understand your competition or yeah, how to really kind of keep in touch with what's going on.
Yeah, it's a challenge. It's one that's actually difficult to manage as well because Web3 is, to your point, it's actually quite big as an industry in terms of its footprint. Um, and there's so much going on all the time because as an industry, it's also very loud,
Mm.
and it's deliberately so because everyone is trying to fight for that attention, right? Um, a lot of times, and you talk to other founders, quite a few of them I've spoken to concede that sometimes you get swept up in just what is the thing that is like topical and is getting all the attention right now, and it does have this like it does infiltrate how you make decisions because you start to it's like the shiny object syndrome. It's like, oh, this is the thing that's like capturing attention and everyone's there, maybe we should be doing and steering our product towards that direction, right? And I would say most of the time that's a bad decision to make
Mm.
because you're losing focus and you're constantly like pivoting towards what is popular at the moment. And by the time that you recognize that it's popular, you're late.
Yeah.
That's usually the saturation point.
Same
And
as
then the meta's over
FOMO,
in
right?
like 2 months. Yeah. It's always that. It's like almost always because, as a founder, your core competency is not discovering new things. You're a consumer of saturated narratives. You're not the discoverer of that. If you want to be a discoverer of that, you should quit your job as being a builder because that takes a lot of time to develop that skill set. So you need to understand about your role, your position, how you're consuming information. You're never going to be first to the curve. You're going to be, on average, a consumer of what was already happened and it's about to basically pass. So if you try to start steering your product development pipeline and pivoting to that, it's a losing prospect. I'm not saying this won't be ever successful, but on average, it's not going to be successful in my opinion. So that's one aspect of it. I think the other aspect of it. So from that standpoint, it's like, oh, don't be overly um, engaging with everything that's happening because it's a distraction. But then the other perspective is like you also cannot have like a head in the sand strategy where it's like, oh, I'm not going to allow any of this noise to bother me. I'm just going to be laser focused on executing what it is I'm doing. That doesn't work either, right? Because you do need to know what's happening. Because at certain points, there will be a narrative or something where it happens to be the core competency of your business.
Mm.
And you need to be there when this is the narrative of the moment. You see what I'm saying? It's not like I'm not trend chasing, but if the narrative is now aligned with what I'm building, I have to step on the gas and capture that. Right? Because you don't have many shots at being the focal point of attention in the space. And if you miss the tailwind, that is to your detriment in terms of being able to build, acquire users, gather more traction, build brand resonance and equity and all of that. So it's hard to manage that. It's very hard to manage. It's hard to discern what is real, what is not, what matters, what it doesn't. I think a general statement I would make about competition is that, unfortunately, in Web3, everyone's competing with everything. Like you may think, oh, I'm an infrastructure project. I don't compete with the gaming projects. No, you do. You compete in attention. You absolutely do. And you're like, oh, meme coins, I don't get it. It's like, I'm above meme coins, right? And it's like, no, you don't understand. Meme coins are competitors, right? Especially in the context of an industry where everyone has a token.
Yeah.
So on that basis, your token is a product that competes against all of these other products that also happen to be tokens, right? So in that setting, this is one of the most intensely competitive industries out there. And it's because of the fact that it's almost at the attention level, which is really like marketing and all that. It's perfect competition.
Mm.
This is like textbook perfect competition, right? And it's exceedingly hard to derive an edge. Very, very, very difficult. So yeah, and you have to recognize that. So I think this maybe builds back to the prior question. I was like, what's unique about Web3? Like, this is another aspect of Web3 that you need to understand. Like, it's insanely competitive because there's this financial value capture mechanism that's tethered to a lot of project, and that in and of itself becomes its own market of this like commoditized thing that's called tokens and NFTs and things like that. And it's like there's no barrier to entry. Anyone can launch anything on at any moment.
Yeah,
And meme coins have showcased that. The most unassuming product, which is in essence just a viral idea, is now capturing the most attention. Like in traditional textbook economics, this should never happen. But like it's the world that we live in. And how do you navigate that kind of dynamic as building actual product? Something that, I think a lot of projects are trying to figure out.
yeah, it's really interesting that you talk about the competition in that way. I don't know why I've never put two and two together like that before. I think I tend to focus on the fact that in Web3 everyone is there trying to build each other up. Like everyone's up for different partnerships with different companies. Like there isn't competition in terms of it doesn't feel like it's like Web2 brands over competing and selling to each other's audiences and this kind of stuff because they're so willing to help. But actually, when you, as you just said it there, when everyone's competing for attention and when your token is a product and you are competing with businesses not just in your niche but across the whole industry. Um, yeah, I never thought about that before, but you're completely right. I don't know why I haven't ever
Yeah,
thought of that. Like that's a big challenge from a competition perspective.
yeah. I think if you talk to founders, like they 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 would come to that realization ultimately. They'll understand like, okay, yeah, actually, if you have a token or an NFTs, that is independently a product that now you have to manage over and beyond the actual product that you're building.
Yeah,
They're kind of related and tethered together, but they're also in some ways separate and distinct. Um, so you almost have like you have to have dual strategies for both sides.
tough job as a founder. Um,
It's not easy.
we've spoken quite a bit about challenges for founders and if you're launching a project. Do you have any advice for someone, say if they don't want to be a founder, they just want to build a real solid career for themselves in the industry? Do you have any advice
Hmm.
for someone who might be looking to do that and how they can set themselves up for success in Web3 specifically?
Yeah. Certainly, I think there are people that fit that kind of archetype that we come across. Like for example, a very good example would be like Web3 specific or Web3 focused like marketing agencies. Like their core competency is understanding how to capture attention in Web3, how to kind of work with the inner networks of communities to be able to distribute. And it's a very specific part of the overall value chain, but they're kind of like category specialists, and this is what they do. Um, so like that's the immediate like example that comes to my mind. Um, I think if I were to think through like unpacking like how do you create that niche for yourself in this space, I think probably it starts with just really digging into it and being like a consumer and or a participant in the flow of that loop. Like you have to intimately understand how Web3 works, um, which is usually quite different than how Web2 works. And the only way that you can kind of build up that intuition base is being in it and almost being like a client or a creator and understand that flow. I think you take away a lot of learnings from that, and then from that experience, then you can start to observe and identify opportunities and gaps, right, where you can come in and service that. And then depending on what you want out of it, is like, okay, do you want something where do you want to scale a really big business by filling a gap? That's one proposition. Another could just be I just want to run a very good kind of independent business. Maybe it's just me, maybe it's me and a few people that support me. I mean, there's a lot of opportunities there in Web3, right? So I think it's all predicated on being kind of, in Web3 they call it just being part of the community to learn how it works. From there, you start to observe and understand what's missing, what are the gaps, what could be done better, and then filling that gap and just doing it, and then offering value to the community as a function of the opportunity that you identified, and then trying to figure out, okay, is this like a business prospect here that I can scale into? Um, if so, then you can start using that kind of initial product market fit that you found to you know influence, gather capital, etc., and to start scaling it, right? So I think that would be my advice. I can see like marketing being one aspect. On the more technical side, there's initially it was a lot of like more kind of deep, kind of smart contract engineering, being able to find like exploits, vulnerabilities, and stuff. Like I know people that build a personal brand around it, right? Like they're like the most coveted white hats in the industry. They have a brand presence in the industry around it. They get a lot of deal flow. They become like investors, a lot of deals. They get paid to do certain types of like white hat, like hacking to try to identify vulnerabilities. Like that's, but it's all about like you being in that environment and just like observing, getting involved with projects, seeing things fall apart, coming in as a community member, helping to fix it, and then you're kind of like building that brand, and then that becomes eventually kind of like a business, right? So I think that's probably the best way to go about it.
That's really good advice. Really good advice. And one question I always like to ask, and obviously throughout the last hour or so, you talked us through some all sorts of different areas, to be honest, and shared all sorts of insight on a lot of topics. But knowing what you know now about technology, about leadership, about Web3, entrepreneurship, if you could go back 10, 15 years, what advice would you have for your younger self?
Yeah, 10, 15 years. Um, I think this is probably just very personal to me. I think one advice I would give my younger self would be like you have much greater capacity than you think you do. Um, and that might be like, yeah, again, like my personal, my own characteristics, my personality. I think when I was growing up, maybe it's like the Eastern culture part of my upbringing that plays a factor into it, where you're a bit more like, it's not conformist, but like you're a part of a bigger community. Like you have a role, right? And it's about like respect for hierarchy, respect for your elders, and I think that does formulate your worldview in terms of your place in a broader system. I think in the Western context, it's very different. Like the ideology of the states is like just get after it, right? um, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. It's just literally like the frontiersman mentality, and anything you can imagine, you can create. I do think there's like a good, healthy like middle ground there, but I do think like over time, um, like for me, I think I grew into that confidence. I didn't innately have that. So if I were to roll back the clock, I would probably tell my younger self like you may be discounting yourself in certain ways that may limit you in terms of the opportunities that you can create for yourself. And it's not like all is lost, because obviously the experience that I've had is you grow into that realization, but maybe I could have kickstarted that a little bit earlier, and really bootstrap that confidence at an earlier stage, and maybe I don't know, things could have worked out in a different way, but I think in terms of that vantage point and that mentality that I had when I was younger relative to where I am now, and even with younger people that I've worked with in my career, I try to convey that to them, to say like you're always capable of something great. but you have to find that thing that makes you tick, right? And a lot of things are just things that don't. They're kind of like superfluous, and you're on the periphery, but you're constantly trying to search for a core process or a discipline or a sense of feeling that when you find it, you're like, oh, this is it. And it's not a job title. It's not like a career choice. To me, it's just like, it's a process. It's a repeatable process. And you can put any label on it you want, but it's like, oh, this is the process ultimately that I really enjoy. And then it's like, then you scaffold all the things around it and you try to find it so that you preserve as much of that as possible, knowing that inevitably there's all this other stuff that comes around it as well.
That's great. Well, yeah, thank you for sharing. I'm sure there'll be people listening who can, yeah, relate to that and get a lot of value out of that. You know, people who are starting their careers or just in their journey into Web3. I think that's really useful to understand. So yeah, thank you for that.
Appreciate it.
But Wei, thank you very much for taking the time to have a conversation today. It's been brilliant. I've learned a lot. Actually, you've blown my mind with yeah the competition in Web3 specifically. Um, but no, thank you. Yeah, thank you very, very much for taking the time. Um, if people are
Appreciate you having me.
No problem at all. If people are interested in finding out more about AI Arena and Arc, is the best place to reach out on Twitter? I guess you guys are all across Twitter, and obviously you have your own websites and stuff as well. Is that the best place
Yeah,
to find out more information?
yes, definitely follow us on Twitter is AI Arena _. Also, we have a new account for Arc. It's called Arc Agents. You can follow us there for all the developments around the infrastructure product. In fact, this week we're going to be rolling out, kind of kicking off the marketing cycle for the Arc product. So definitely follow us there for all the latest information.
Nice. Away. Thanks again. Thank you very, very much for your time. And I'm sure we'll speak soon.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me on. This was a lot of fun.
Take care.
Take care, Jack.